my name is Dr. Jason Jones. I'm a registered psychologist in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I mostly spend my time working with couples and individuals doing sex therapy. And I'm a member of ASECT, which is the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And so it was through there that I became a certified sex therapist, and I also do supervision for people who are trying to become certified sex therapists as well. So, the vast majority of my clinical work and research has always been in the sexual health area. When I did my PhD, it was focused on fat sexuality and fat phobia. So trying to help bring more inclusivity around, members of the population that have generally been pushed to the fringes of sexuality and not being able to completely express authentically for themselves because of society's phobias that have been created over the years. So I do a lot of individual work around sexual functioning, pornography, and managing couples' infidelities and discussing that process with them is also a big part. So yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and learning about human sexuality all day. It's it's a great great place to be.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your doctoral work in that area?
Yeah, it's quite a passion project because the first part of it is around fat, or what we used to kind of label as obesity. um, and so really the preferred nomenclature, what clients, participants tell me, is that they do want to reclaim the word fat. And
Really?
yeah, and use fat to reclaim that space, to not be ashamed of being fat, but to actually own it. And that's really been one of the things that society has had a lot of barriers around. Certain groups don't get looked at in terms of sexual beings in the same way that other groups do, like in the heteronormative kind of groups. So fat people, and I would include older adults as well in that. Anything that does seem to, society is not generally inclusive of, because there's the thin ideal in terms of society, which has been propagated for many, many years through, capitalism, keeping the patriarchy kind of alive for men. Um, so so fat phobia has its roots in a lot of these embedded institutions. How we go about life, we don't even realize that the environment is not built for bigger people, and people are not expecting there to be sexuality from bigger people. And just like they don't expect sexuality out of older adults or disabled individuals. So they get kind of treated a bit differently by society in that lens. And there are big effects on that. So in my research, some of the big effects and impacts that had on, and my research was just focused on females, was that there was a lot of hiding and avoidance patterns that seemed to happen around like dating, that they didn't feel like they were of the appropriate shape or ideal to attract attention, and so they would avoid the whole process, or they would avoid dating, they would avoid trying to socialize, and so they also were feeling encumbered by people's expectations around their sexuality too, and what people perceive as them being sexual beings, sexual objects, or even like some fetishization that can happen around that as well. So My research really kind of showed me that the lived experiences of bigger bodies for females is that it it feels like they're pushed out of the sexual space that they can participate in and have connection with others, that they're kind of being pushed outside of that, as if, they are non-sexual or asexual kind of beings. And that then impacts their ability to learn about relationships, to start exploring how to socialize in their relationships, and then about how to use their sexuality, how they want to use it, how they might feel like they can own and reclaim that space of their sexuality. And so oftentimes, sexuality can be a great venue to feel very accepted and to feel that lasting loving connection or sense of belonging. But that can often be missed because in society, whether or not other people are always judging and rejecting bigger people are feeling that, they're experiencing that in their lives, and they feel a lot of shame around it, so they do tend to hide. There's a wonderful book that really speaks to this, and really extrapolates from some of the research. It's called "The Body Is Not an Apology" by Sonia Renee Taylor. And that is an excellent book around like owning, like coming out as fat, owning that space that this is okay. I am a sexual being. I don't need to hide. Um, and so that book is often a great resource for clients to continue to build on, how do they engage in a world that doesn't seem to accept them to the same degree, or look at them maybe as sexual beings that they do for others, and what that experience is like for women. Especially women are often the ones as the object of the desires.
What you said is they almost feel like they don't have permission to be sexual. And we need to remember that. I mean, will you tell me, is it true? Is everyone sexual? Are there people that are not sexual at all? Or does everyone have some form of a sexuality to some degree?
I look at sexuality similar to like food. It is something that is a part of all of our human experiences, but that can be very different depending on the individual that's experiencing that. There's some research around like asexuality and aces, and what that might look like for individuals as an orientation, that they are primarily non-sexual. However, there's a lot of research in that's kind of contradictory, that sometimes asexual individuals are still masturbating or still have fantasies, and so it's hard to call them completely asexual, although like maybe a percent or so of the population might qualify as asexual. But most people go away from their sexuality because there was some danger around it. And then they're in a space of needing to find their own confidence and permission to take those risks again, to be vulnerable and put themselves out in those spaces again. So usually it's, they've gotten some perceptions of either rejection or judgment, or even traumas that can happen. And then they're having to think about, well, what is the nature of my sexuality? What does it actually look like for me? It might look different than it does for others.
I do think that many people in society, no matter who they are, have pulled away from certain parts of their sexuality because society doesn't really allow for full expression of sexuality, it seems. If you're fully in your sexuality, it's almost something that you have to hide or keep to yourself. Many people, like you said, don't even have the space or the permission to really explore themselves in that way. They may not even know who they are sexually. We've certainly seen that to be true on Live Jasmine with different members who come to the site because they might have a fantasy that they've never been able to act out, or they're too afraid to really explore with their current partner if they have a partner. And so they want to safely explore it with someone that they don't know, which I think makes them feel a little bit safer because they never have to see that person again. Although they do end up, it seems many of them developing relationships with that model, maybe because they were able to express such a vulnerable part of themselves that they normally can't. Um, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Have many of us pulled away from aspects of our sexuality because we have shame or guilt or fear around it?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, because sexuality in our like more North American culture has traditionally been very taboo. We don't talk about it. If you talk about it, it's generally it's awkward or it's uncomfortable. There hasn't been like a good space to get, healthy scientific sex education that is to everybody. Lots of different jurisdictions handle it slightly differently, not necessarily based on what the current science is. There's a lot of political concerns around sexuality and teaching sexuality. So as soon as people realize that this is not a topic like food or anything else that people do in their daily lives, they get the impression that it is something that they need to hide, or they need to be very careful around, because there's lots of risks in society with being too forward around your sexuality and some of those risks and the vulnerabilities that come up with that. So a lot of people experience, some form of rejection or judgment, having tried to express some of their authentic sexual self, then kind of putting them back into, more of an avoidance space with it, because it is so traumatic. If we don't talk about sexuality very often, we don't talk about that there are reasonable variances in sexuality. It's not always easy. There's often, conflicts around that internally and interpersonally. Those are normal experiences, normal parts of sexual health, as they are with, like, all other kinds of behaviors that people have. But this one is not one that people get to talk about, to kind of normalize that their experience is okay, it's not abnormal. I think the foundational sex education that our culture usually receives is that, like, you're supposed to just know how to do it at a certain point when you become an adult, and you don't need to learn intricacies about it. You don't need to learn the emotional part about it. They don't even really talk about the pleasurable aspects of it. So then people expect that they should be able to know how to do this. They were told, like, if you're not able to do this, there must be something wrong with you. So then they really pathologize themselves in thinking that there is something wrong with their sexuality because of how it was experienced in a social setting. Pulling back from that, and then it can be really hard to re-engage and take those risks again, because we know what they've experienced. It's not because they haven't had valid, legitimate, harmful experiences. They have, and that's also part of the battle, is how do you really own your sexuality and be authentic with it when our society's context doesn't really permit a full expression or range of expression with that. So yeah, a lot of people will, hide it, or, put some of their kinks into like a dormant place, hoping that, they won't get too loud and need to be expressed, and just kind of keep them down there where it feels safer.
If people do start to suppress themselves in that way, What are some of the consequences that could arise within them? Are there psychological consequences? Are there physiological consequences?
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, a crude expression with it, it might be, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If we are not engaging our sexual selves, that might also mean that we're not engaging in any relational aspects of ourselves either. That part of the avoidance or the hiding is that, we just shut the whole thing down. We don't want to come out and play. And so it's just we try to compartmentalize it as if it doesn't exist, or if it isn't a part of who we are, that might need to be expressed in some kind of way. What I would kind of add to that I talk about a lot with people is this continuum of authenticity and belongingness.
Yeah.
So as we are more authentic, the more challenging it is to belong.
Wow.
Right? As we are less authentic, the easier it is to find belonging.
Wow, that's a really interesting and powerful statement. And I think that a lot of people can relate to that. I mean, how many times do we want to speak up about something that maybe we're uncomfortable with or we don't like, but we don't want to deal with a potentially negative reaction from someone? So we just keep it to ourselves and suppress it down,
Yep.
which takes away our authenticity, but maybe gives us a sense of good rapport and belonging with that person or those people.
It helps us fit in. And that's the tension is around fitting in and being ourselves and that authentic self.
How do we navigate this tug and pull because or this dynamic? Because I feel that fitting in is obviously a fundamental core need of a human being. We really need connection and belonging. I don't know if that goes back to caveman days. It's somewhere in our DNA where if we weren't together, there was no survival, right? Like to survive, we had to have the tribe. Obviously, life has evolved beyond that. I don't know that our DNA has because we still have that drive for connection, but you can survive on your own. But it's very painful if you don't have areas or people where you feel that connection. And at the same time, if it's at the cost of being authentic, I mean, I'm sure that that's not healthy for us either. So, how do we navigate that place?
And this is really, the essence of the fat sex phenomenon. How do we own our authenticity and who we are and not have shame around that, when at the same time society is actively trying to shame us around it? And so in order to belong, um, there's this tension that exists. Because if we really want to be authentic, that might limit our ability to fit in and belong with others. And if we are focused too much on belonging and like people pleasing or thinking about others way ahead of us, then we're going to be kind of lost with our needs for independence and individuality and stuff like that. So it's a very hard line to walk, because you can't just say, well, be authentic, just own it, completely own your space. Like that would be great. And maybe in an ideal cultural context that would work well, but we're going to run into some problems with what society thinks. Now, does that mean that we just want to build up more resiliency skills to kind of like keep pushing in that way? But at the same time, as you mentioned, the urge, the need to connect, the need to belong is so high. It is more important for us than food is in our DNA. And the DNA is so extensive with it that this is something that, is all mammals all mammals got this connection and an attachment DNA process for their survival and their evolution. And some birds, and there's even some research around some reptiles that might have some of this as well. So it's so deeply embedded for us that if we feel too alone, we feel like that's almost death. And right now, with the political environment that we're all in, everything is so highly charged.
Yes.
Um, and people are only getting heard if they are very black and white on a topic, instead of kind of the more realistic nuances of all of this.
It's really true. And that's actually another really good point that you bring up, is that it seems like less and less overall in society, we're losing this ability for authenticity because there seems to be such extreme punishment for upsetting the group or the mob.
Yeah.
Social media is a great place. Like, it's a great example of this, where there are certain pockets of social media almost all over it, where there's a mob mentality one way or the other. And so if you maybe authentically believe or feel something that's against this particular mentality, you have thousands of people that are ready to just attack everything about you and cast you out, which is so painful. And it's very clear why someone would not find that worth it. And so they are quiet on issues that might be deeply meaningful to them.
Well, yeah, and I think that, that really speaks to, what we're talking about is, I think, how do we help more marginalized communities who don't typically get to exist in the sexual space? How do we help them feel less marginalized? How do we bring them into a space that says it's for everybody? Sexuality is for all of us. We're all humans. We all have a part of that in us. So which is also a part of kind of the broader social context that we've all identified more recently around, the bigger changes that we're looking for in society to be more inclusive, to respect the diversity much more, not have this heteronormativity rule book that says that if you do not follow this persona or this type, then we are going to shame you as punishment, to try and force you to comply to fit into the rest of this mob mentality. So yeah, I think this, in the sexual space, that we're also really talking about big societal changes, and the needs for that in order to integrate what the diverse opinions and experiences are, so that we can actually learn from them and make better decisions in every area. So yeah, that's a big component of this. Is one of the mantras that I use is through science to justice.
Hmm.
And that's been such a big part of the sexual health research and clinical work with clients over time, is that the more that we can talk about it, the more we can research it, the more inclusive we will be able to be, because there's strong evidence for inclusivity helping everybody, and the diverse experiences helping all of us, not just those who are marginalized. We don't want shame around something that someone can't control, around their preferences or what they like or what they seem to gravitate towards. Now, this is only in the context of like non-offending sexual behaviors, just to be clear on that.
Absolutely. Yes. So thank you. That is a great point. Yes, this is all about situations where you're not actually harming or hurting anyone, and they're fully consenting and
Mm-hmm.
safe.
Yeah, and it's really that consent process
Yeah.
that becomes the negotiation, with couples or even with a single person who's looking for an outlet. What does that consent conversation look like? And is it firm? Is it able to be really nailed down and comfortable? That sets up the safety that might be required to, take those risks and talk about it and maybe explore those areas.
Very well said. Yeah. If there was one thing that you could really get across to the world about human sexuality that you just don't think the world is quite getting right now, but you wish that they would, what would that thing be?
Everybody is a sexual being and everybody has rights to their sexuality. The World Health Organization and the World Association for Sexual Health have drafted documents on sexual rights. And those sexual rights are things that we should all know about. We should all be teaching about. We should be talking to our kids about. When we go through the angle of what are our sexual rights, what are our human rights around this, and we start from there, that clarifies a lot about our decision making process. That no matter what your sexuality is right now, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with you unless there is a dysfunction or disorder that would be assessed otherwise. But whatever your sexuality is, it's okay. It makes sense. There are reasons around it. Sometimes we might not know exactly what they are, but it makes sense. I really would want to encourage people to explore their authentic sexual space and own it as this is okay. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not breaking any laws. So what's the issue, right? It's the shame that is taking people out of owning their authentic sexual spaces.
What are your thoughts on things like camming?
Well, camming has been like incredibly transformative, I think, to the whole sex industry. That has changed things significantly from 10, 20, 30 years ago, around how people were able to consume this. And so it has changed things, and as things change again, we're always playing catch up with trying to understand what the meaning of the change is and what's going on, and the advantages and disadvantages of it.
How do we create a more sex positive or sex healthy society?
Well, I think that it starts with those of us who have the privilege of being in safer positions to use our voice and to talk about it and to name it, especially to name it for those marginalized populations that might not be able to name it, for themselves because they haven't been able to participate. They're marginalized, right? So being able to use our whatever privileges that we do have, in our positions, like I can talk to all of my clients about all of these issues, all of bring it to their attention. I think that that's really important. Getting it out on social media, just opening up the conversation, because that's where we are at this stage, is just to try and get people more comfortable with having these conversations, so that we can get further in where we go with the dialogue. So yeah, for those of us who are in more positions of privilege, I think, yeah, using our voice, to name these issues, and to stand up for it, is just the start, but a very important start.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful interview.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah.